Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Special Education News and Noteworthy, the podcast where we break down the news and noteworthy things happening in special education throughout the U.S. and talk about what they mean for students, families, educators, and advocates. I'm Paige Fitzgerald.
And I'm Kate McGaldy.
Before we get started, if you're enjoying the podcast, we'd love for you to take a moment to follow the show on Spotify. Following this podcast helps more families find us and ensures that you never miss a new episode.
So this week we're talking about special education funding, dyslexia screening, employment opportunities for autistic students, residential placements, and a major investigation into school policing practices. Let's jump right in.
Okay. So our first story comes from Disability Scoop. For the first time in more than 2 decades, the federal government is moving forward with a nationwide study examining how much schools actually spend to educate students with disabilities. The National Special Education Spending Study will collect data from school districts and schools across the country to better understand what special education services cost today and how those costs compare to current funding levels. The last major federal study looking at special education spending examined data from the 1999 to 2000 school year. So policymakers and advocates have been relying on information that's more than 20 years old. Advocates say updated data is long overdue and could provide important insight into whether current funding levels are keeping pace with student needs.
You know, what's that to me is that making funding decisions using information that's over 20 years old is mind-boggling.
Yeah, but sadly, I feel like it's not surprising. Funding in special education is a mess, right? It's consistently been a mess. It's always been underfunded. And I'm happy that this is going on. And hopefully the result of this will actually lead to some actual change in the way that special education is funded. Because, you know, I mean, the idea has never been funded to what Congress has proposed, right? They've said that they were going to support school districts a certain amount, and they've never actually followed through with that. I believe it was like 40%. They've never funded up to 40%. So
Yeah, and never mind, we've seen increases specifically in autism. We've seen increases in autism identification. There's a lot of mental health challenges. Like we are at the brink of needing the supports more so than ever. And so often we hear districts saying, we don't have the budget for that. We don't have the budget for that. And it's like it's not only a nice thing, it's a needed thing at this point.
yeah, absolutely. It'll be interesting because, obviously they do track how much states are getting, but there also hasn't been really looking into like, okay, what is it going to? Like how much of those costs is it actually covering for the things that it's going to? So I'm interested to see it.
Yeah, same. And I just want to say one more thing, with when parents are talking about different placement decisions and, not only like we don't have the budget for that service, like we just have to continue to know and do what's right for our students despite what the financial situation of the district is, because bringing in advocates can hopefully help support and kind of push the district to making and giving the services that those students need and should have.
Yeah. And it's always a tricky conversation to have with districts too when you're
Yeah,
talking
I
about
get it. I get it. Yeah.
but
Okay.
that is the song. That is the song that they continue to sing because I mean and it is true. The budgets are not there for many things, but
Yeah. But that doesn't mean that students' needs can't be met. So,
true.
story 2 is from EdSource. Our second story comes from EdSource and focuses on California's ongoing efforts to improve reading outcomes for students. California currently requires schools to screen students in kindergarten through second grade for reading difficulties, including dyslexia. Now, Governor Gavin Newsom is proposing that schools wait until later in the school year before using screening results to identify students who may be at risk. Supporters of the proposal argue that students need time to receive instruction before screening results can accurately reflect potential reading difficulties. Others worry that delaying screenings could delay access to interventions and support for students who are struggling. One important point that should be highlighted in the discussion is that screenings are not diagnoses. They are tools that help students identify students who may need additional support, instruction, or further evaluation. So much to say about this one.
I think
So much.
this is really interesting because part of the argument that those wanting to keep the screening timeline the same were saying was that yeah, you're seeing those big jumps mid-year because you had that beginning of the year screening and because those students were identified and got those supports because The ones that were for changing it to not having to screen right away were saying, by mid-year, I forget what the percentage was, but X amount of these students, all of those issues that they were having of being behind, they caught up because they didn't have exposure to print and to formal instruction and reading. But it really is one of those things where I get it. It makes sense to be like, okay, is it because identifying these students and able to get those interventions in place that then the reading shoots up, or is it just a natural progression for
Progression.
students, yeah, being exposed to instruction? And it didn't seem like there was a clear answer to that. And I feel like if you're going to go through all this work to change something at a statewide level, you should have an answer to that to make sure that it is, in fact, the fact that they are new to formal reading instruction and not the fact that these interventions are the things that are helping them catch up. It didn't seem like they had a very clear answer that it was one over the other. And that's concerning to me.
Right. I agree with you. I think you can look at it both ways. Is it a natural progression? Is it something that needs to be handled right away? I mean, so many kids, there's such a discrepancy within classrooms for different ages. My child in particular he's 9 and there's kids that are 11 years old in this class. Like what those kids were doing in kindergarten compared to my child, was it that he was behind? Was it that he had a reading difficulty or disability? you know, so like natural progression showed thankfully that he did not, but I think, there's at least in our district, there's so many kiddos lately that are being diagnosed with dyslexia like way later on, much later than they should have been identified. And I think that if we had the proper screening tool to put specific interventions into place that are targeted for those kids with dyslexia, even if you're not putting a label on the diagnoses of dyslexia, but you're just targeting and giving that, if it's, Orton Gillingham, if it's Wilson, whatever it might be, that you're just trying to support them with interventions early on. Hopefully, we're avoiding the situation that many kids are in middle school right now.
Yeah. I mean, I think we were saying it last week, and this is, we were talking about early intervention, like little kiddos. But I mean, really, the earlier that you can identify a disability and give those supports, the better the outcome. So,
Yeah, yeah.
whole, wholeheartedly agree. Our third story comes from the Hetchinger Report and highlights colleges that are helping autistic students successfully transition into employment. The article follows students at Drexel University and explores how colleges are offering career readiness courses, mock interviews, one on one coaching, and partnerships with employers to help autistic students navigate the hiring process. Many autistic individuals face barriers during traditional interviews, where social communication styles can sometimes be valued more heavily than actual job qualifications. At the same time, this article highlights strengths that many autistic individuals bring to the workplace, including attention to detail, pattern recognition, problem solving, and deep expertise in areas of interest. The story serves as a reminder that transition planning doesn't end at graduation. Preparing students for meaningful employment and independent adulthood is a critical part of long term success.
So we have something. We know somebody that is in this career force, and Ray Gordon from Lumi Workplace. If you haven't heard of him before, please look him up. But he just feels so empowered and he's on a mission right now to make sure that autistic individuals are given the opportunities. And from conversations that we've had with him so many times, what's preventing people from getting these jobs with people that have disabilities from getting these jobs is that job interview, and they can't navigate it efficiently. But when they're in the job, like what Ray continues to say and preach over and over again is that if they are in the job, they can do the job 10 times better than most people. They have savant skills. So, if you are a data analytics person and you can be reading things for a certain company, like it might not mean that you might have a lot of socialization with peers that are within your company, but you're going to do a damn good job at that particular skill. I know somebody else that really struggles socially, but if you give him any problem that's on the computer. It doesn't even need to be a computer in front of him. He can help you navigate exactly where and how and when you're supposed to click whatever button. I mean, that's a skill that many people don't have, but what's preventing them from getting these positions is the interview and the opportunity that a lot of corporations are not allowing or giving. So,
Yeah. And I mean, I think it's great that it's helping otherwise people that would graduate and really face difficulties because they need these support. So I think it's great. And I just want to say that we obviously recognize that not every person on the spectrum has savant skills as well. Like sometimes that can be a little bit of an over stereotype, but there everybody has their strengths and their challenges. And it's really great to see something out here that is helping these students work with and around their challenges to be fully employed. I think that's wonderful.
Read. Okay, our fourth story comes from the Associated Press and examines how special education funding is being used to support residential treatment placements for some students with disabilities. The investigation looked at private residential facilities that receive funding through students' IEPs when teams determine that a residential placement is necessary to meet a student's educational needs. Residential placements can be an appropriate option for some students with significant educational, behavioral, or mental health needs. The report raises questions about oversight, transparency, and accountability, particularly when students are placed in an out of state program. Advocates interviewed in the article expressed concerns about how placements are monitored and whether states have adequate systems in place to track student outcomes and safety. This is a concerning one,
Yeah,
just
I mean,
because a lot of times they're not there. Go ahead.
we always put the links to the articles in the show notes, so I highly recommend everyone read all the articles, but this one in particular is just so interesting because you're funneling children into a for-profit institution, and what they're essentially saying is that there seems to be some history, some evidence of educational consultants getting kickbacks for the places that they are recommending students be sent to. I believe the reporter in there was saying, she had made a call to one of these centers, and the center had said, "Oh, well, in order for them to be placed here, like they have to have a recommendation from an educational consultant. Educational consultant is $10,000, and then they would get that placement into the school." So that's concerning, right? Anytime we're financially incentivizing placement at a school, that's super concerning. These children are going in with the label of emotional disturbance. Updated version of that would be emotional disability, which can really run the gamut from, a diagnosis of oppositional defiance or anxiety to just a child who's having some behavioral challenges at school. I think the most concerning thing is the lack of oversight. Any of these students are being placed out of state, and then there doesn't seem to be in place sufficient monitoring to see, okay, so what's happening with this school? Are they crossing their T's and dotting their I's in terms of compliance? One state official, I can't think of it right now, I want to say Missouri, in the article was saying that they, they got pushback, I believe, from schools because they were saying that now they have to do interviews with the students to get them on the phone and actually hear on a non-monitored line of how things are going. I know Paris Hilton does some wonderful work for advocacy for private schools that are for teens that have behavioral challenges because she was abused at a treatment center. And so I don't think this is a problem that's coming close to nearly being solved. I think there's probably a lot of shady actors and characters here. And, hopefully this is the beginning of really trying to suss out what's going on, especially when children are being moved out of state for
Mhm.
placement.
Mhm.
There's less communication. Sometimes the district is just completely out of the loop of what's going on in terms of like how they're getting updated with it. There's not family members usually nearby to check in on the well-being of these children, and unfortunately, that is often a recipe for abuse. So, I think this is just the beginning of hopefully really figuring this out.
Yeah, and I think kind of piggybacking a story that we talked about last week, it just reiterates the need for accountability of programs, but how families just need to have that trust within the schools to know that their child is making progress academically, but very much so socially, emotionally, and especially when they're far away, you want to be able to provide parents and families with data driven decisions, but also just overall how that student is progressing. And if you don't have, those checkpoints and the accountability within the program, families are left to just really not trust what's going on. So it's hard.
Yeah. So for
You go, go.
So our final story this week comes from a joint investigation by the New York Times and the San Antonio Express News. The investigation examined school policing practices in Texas, following legislation that expanded police presence on school campuses after the tragedy in Uvalde. Reporters reviewed thousands of incidents involving use of force and found cases where students were pepper sprayed, tackled, restrained, handcuffed, or tased during disciplinary incidents. The report included examples involving students with disabilities and raised concerns about how schools respond when students are dysregulated, struggling behaviorally, or experiencing emotional distress. The story has sparked broader conversations about the role of law enforcement in schools, the importance of de escalation, and how schools can balance safety with appropriate supports for students. So, shout out to Texas for saying trauma informed behavior interventions, passe. Let's do trauma inducing.
So
But in all
difficult to even
serious, yeah, but in all serious,
talk about this.
it's extremely concerning. This is, again, something that we've linked in the show notes that you can see, but the New York Times has videos that are really disturbing,
Hmm.
honestly, of a young girl she had been pepper sprayed. And as she is clearly not showing any signs of aggression anymore after being pepper sprayed in the face, gets kneed in the face.
Yeah. A kid that was vaped was thrown into like face first into lockers. So viewer discretion advised and then some.
Yeah, and there's, one particular incident in the story where a child with a disability was hogtied, um, and this was an elementary school age child. So it's incredibly concerning, and I don't necessarily think that the main issue here is whether or not police officers can or should be in schools, because they do also note that they've had success in confiscating weapons and intervening in what they assume would have been another school shooting. So I think there's something to say of them doing some good work. But should schools be relying on them for behavior intervention? Absolutely not. If the purpose is to keep students and teachers and admin safe from violence like that, it shouldn't be, they're not trained for that, right? They're not trained for behavior intervention for children that are dealing with trauma, emotional disabilities, just being teens and not having a fully developed frontal lobe. We've all met a teenager. They can be frustrating, but to be in a position of power and to take, a student throwing a cheese stick at you and to then aggressively assault them, essentially. You're putting your hands on a student, you're throwing them against the walls, you're tasing them, you're doing all of these really terrible things. There has to be better oversight. And what right now it doesn't seem like there's as much as there should be. Some schools aren't even apparently allegedly writing up incident reports for these things. One student was given a concussion and hospitalized, and it's just going too far in the other direction, I think. And school is
Yeah.
supposed to be a safe space for kids, and that includes the kids with emotional disabilities. It includes the kids with behavioral needs. It includes the kids that sometimes act like jerks because sometimes kids can be jerks. Like,
Yeah.
they also deserve to be safe in school. And yes, there has to be behavior intervention and there has to be, an area of safety that's, created by the school. But I don't think it involves having police officers step in place of behavioral interventions by the school.
Right. I mean, when I was teaching, there were probably 10 of us that were trained in significant behavioral interventions, like the more intense behaviors. And I think it was for everybody's safety. They knew properly like what was allowed in the school district. They knew how to, you know, deregulate kids that were really like going bananas at the times. But what people, specifically police officers that are doing this, they're not trained, but they often can mistake. They don't really know the child as a whole, and they often can mistake, what you were saying, Paige, like emotional regulation, lack of communication. But like a kid that's like set on sensory overload, they can really misunderstand and assume that their child is being defiant, but maybe they're not. Maybe it's that they need a break in that moment to get themselves regulated in a certain fashion. But when you don't know the students, when you're not there and working with that individual student on a day-to-day basis, it can appear that the child is being super defiant, disrespectful, but in reality, maybe you need to be following his behavior intervention plan or her, de-escalation techniques, whatever it might be. So it was just this article is really, really disturbing to me, and especially those videos. And it's not our first rodeo dealing with something like this in Texas. So it's
And,
just
you know,
difficult.
I think about how some states, counties, they have specific training for police officers.
Mhm.
Probably seen it on social media and such of how they're trained to be able to interact and support better when they're pulling over drivers who are on the autism spectrum, and they're getting training on how to, just handle being able to talk to someone who might not always be getting the cues that you're giving, or maybe it seems like they're not following directions, but really they're on sensory overload. So there's been some trainings lately that police departments do around that of how to help people in their community who do have disabilities, and they might have to interact with them in a different way. It
Which is
makes me
awesome.
wonder if Texas is going to put police officers in schools, does there need to be a different type of training now that they get of
Absolutely.
if you're positioned in a school, there has to be a different way that you are interacting with these children, some of whom do have disabilities, because it is different than, you're not breaking up a prison riot here. It is like that is not it's not okay to just respond with full force to children and the trauma that you can be giving to these kids. I mean, one officer slammed a kid against the wall and was like, "Who's next?"
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
terrifying. That's
It's
terrifying.
terrifying. The videos are terrifying. Well, those are this week's top stories in special education.
If you'd like to dive deeper into this week's topics, be sure to check out the full newsletter. This week's Special Education Insight focuses on understanding restrictive and least restrictive placements, including how placement decisions are made and what families should know about the continuum of services available through special education.
We've also included a couple of summer focused picks of the week that we think that families will really enjoy as summer break gets underway.
And before you go, if you're finding these conversations helpful, please take a moment to follow the podcast on Spotify, rate us 5 stars if you feel so moved.
Because
If you
my
don't feel
because
so
my voice because my voice, you can actually hear me this time around. Because I've got a mic now. Be
she's
prepared,
got a
everybody.
she's got a fancy mic and she's crisp. She's crisp as ever.
Hopefully,
So
hopefully.
give us 5 stars. Write a comment about how crisp our voices sounded. That'd be lovely. But following the show helps us reach more families, educators, and advocates, and it ensures that you'll be notified when new episodes are released.
So thank you for spending part of your week with us. Until next time, please stay hopeful, stay vocal, and take care of yourself.
Bye,
Bye,
everyone.
everyone.